The Runaway Robot by Lester Del Rey. Chapter 2. Down the River. Mrs. Simpson stared at her husband with a blank look on her face, and he got the satisfaction of really surprising his family. Then the hubbub started. "Oh, Roger, when?" Mrs. Simpson jumped out of her chair, and Mr. Simpson took her in his arms and swung her around the way he often swung little 9-year-old Jane. It took quite a while for the excitement to die down. I stood in the doorway without saying anything, and after a while they quieted down. "How soon do we leave, Daddy?" Jane asked. "In about 10 days, he said. "And that reminds me, I have some more news." "Goodness," Mrs. Simpson laughed. "How could there be any more to what you've told us?" "There is," Paul's father answered. "And this is it. We aren't returning to Earth on any old passenger freighter." This was amazing, and Paul stared at his father. "But, Dad, second-class ships are the only ones that make the Jupiter run." This was true. Anyone visiting the moons of Jupiter had to ride the big, lumbering freighters that carried both passengers and heavy supplies for the moon colonies. This was because there was not enough luxury passenger trade that far out to make passenger runs possible. Jane danced up and down, clapping her hands. "How are we going, Daddy? Tell us." "Well," Mr. Simpson replied, smiling, "this is going to be a big transfer of company personnel, so they're sending an Orion-class space liner to pick us up, the Star Queen." "Why, Dad," Paul exclaimed, "they use Orion-type liners on the Venus runs. They have everything. Swimming pools, three-dimensional plays beamed in. They can even teleport fresh fruit, bananas, and oranges," Jane added. Mrs. Simpson patted her daughter's head. "You poor dear. You've never eaten a fresh orange, have you?" Mr. Simpson laughed. "She hasn't exactly been starved. The frozen ones are pretty good." "A luxury liner," Paul repeated as though he couldn't believe it. He told me all about how things are done in the inner planets. The big ships that take people to the resorts and vacation spots on Mars and Venus. The wonders of the space age that meant so much to humans. "We've been pioneers for a long time," Mr. Simpson said. "Now we're going back and learning to live like people again." When Paul grabbed me by my arms and began dancing me in a circle, Mr. Simpson, who had quieted down, watched us very thoughtfully, with a slight frown on his face. "Come on, Rex," Paul said. "We've got a lot to do and only 10 days to do it in." He started to pull me out of the room, but Mr. Simpson said, "I've got an errand for Rex, Paul. I want him to take some papers over to the plant. While he's gone, I'll brief you on a few plans I have." He spoke briskly, and though he wasn't sharp with Paul or anything like that, I could tell that something bothered him. Paul was too excited to notice. "All right," he said. "I want to take as much of the load off your shoulders as I can, Dad." Mr. Simpson smiled again. A kind of tight smile, I thought, and put his arm around Paul's shoulders. "Thanks, Paul. You're growing up, you know, and you have to start facing some of the obligations of an adult, even the unpleasant ones." I knew that meant something bad and wondered what it was. Paul still didn't seem to notice. He said, "What's unpleasant about getting ready to go to Earth, Dad?" Mr. Simpson didn't answer. He took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to me. "Give that to Mr. Kagan in the number 2 refinery, Rex. You don't have to wait for an answer." I left immediately. On the way to the plant, I did a lot of wondering. Why had Mr. Simpson wanted to get rid of me? He had a reason, I was sure of it. As I ran towards the plant, I thought about the 10 days that would pass before the big luxury liner would take us back to Earth. And I was glad there were Earth days, not the longer ones based on Ganymede's revolutions around Jupiter. On Ganymede, a day and a night is about 170 hours long, compared to Earth's 24-hour night and day. Paul told me that on Earth the nights are very dark and the days are passed under the bright blazing sun. It's a little different on Ganymede. There it never gets very dark because Jupiter fills most of the sky overhead and always reflects a lot of the sun's light. Ganymede goes by Earth time, with signals beamed out regularly from Earth to keep the chronometers right. I reached the number 2 plant without thinking of anything Mr. Simpson might have been upset about. Mr. Kagan, the foreman, was busy in the office, so I had to wait a while. I passed the time watching a plant robot run a fungus refining unit. You couldn't look inside, but I knew how it worked. The fungus was put in a tank at the top, big masses of it, and water was poured in. The water was heated, and that helped the fungus juices run out when the pressure was applied. The water and the juices were squeezed into a lower tank, and because the juices were heavier, the water always stayed on top. All they had to do was open a valve at the bottom and let the juice run into the shipment tanks. It was a very simple operation. I stood there wondering what the juice did to heal people on Earth. I didn't really care, not right then. I was wondering a lot more about something else. When Mr. Kagan came out, I gave him the letter and headed right back to the residential domes. I ran as fast as I could, but the trip took about an hour. When I let myself into the apartment, I heard Paul and his father talking. They hadn't heard me come in, and I stopped where I was and listened, thinking that I'd be able to find out what the trouble was. They were in the den with the other door closed, and I couldn't get many of the words very clearly, but the voice tones showed that Paul was upset and angry. This was unusual. Mr. Simpson wasn't the kind of parent that children argued with. I don't mean that he was harsh or cruel in any way. He and Mrs. Simpson believed in discipline, in their children doing the right thing, but they made it easy, because they were always more than fair and had their children's best interests at heart. Most of the time, the Simpson home was full of laughter and gaiety. That was what made belonging to Paul so nice. But now Paul was raising his voice to his father, and Mr. Simpson was being stern as a result. They moved closer to the door, and I heard some words. Paul said, "It's not fair, selling him down the river." Mr. Simpson laughed. "Where did you hear that expression?" "I don't know. I heard it somewhere." "You don't even know what it means." I didn't know what it meant either. I knew what a river was. Paul had told me they have them on Earth. Earth is almost all water, and rivers where the water runs from one place to another. Down the river would mean with the current, because rivers respond to gravity and always follow the path of least resistance. But I couldn't see what that had to do with whatever was bothering Paul. It was very mysterious, but I didn't want to get caught listening. I went to Paul's room and waited for him to arrive. I knew he would tell me all about it when he got there. But he didn't. He came into the room and saw me standing there and said, "Oh, it's you." His tone was sullen, and he was frowning as he walked right past me and threw himself on the bed without paying any more attention to me. I didn't know what to say, not understanding his moods, so I waited. This annoyed him. "Well," he demanded, "can't you say something? Do you have to just stand there?" I knew this was very serious, because he almost never talked to me that way. "What do you want me to say?" "Anything you feel like saying." "It will be very exciting going back to Earth." "Yes, won't it?" He spoke the words sarcastically, and what I'd said seemed to make him even angrier. "What's so hot about Earth anyhow? Things haven't been bad on Ganymede." "No, but on Earth you won't have to wear an airsuit every time you go outside." "I'd feel like a fool without my airsuit." "No, you won't, because other people won't be wearing them either." "You're awfully logical for a robot," he snorted. "I have a pre-established logic quotient that allows me to reason elementary." "Oh, cut it out. I'm tired. I'm going to take a nap." I stood there and waited while Paul turned over on the bed and scowled at me. A robot is supposed to be turned off when not in use. That's what happens to all labor robots, because they run on batteries and it makes sense to save their charge. But Paul had never turned me off. That was because I was a companion, and even after he went to bed we used to talk a lot. When he drifted off to sleep, I would stand and wait until he woke up, and we'd go on from there. A full charge lasted me about 10 Earth days under those conditions, and when I got sleepy it meant that my batteries were running low. When I went unconscious, they were empty. A sullen look came into Paul's eyes as he got off the bed and reached for the switch box on my chest. I could hardly believe it. I'd never been turned off before, but now I was going to be. My last thought as he switched me off was to wonder what I'd done to make him angry. I woke up. Mr. Simpson was in Paul's room with a stranger. Paul was not there. As my consciousness came back, Mr. Simpson was saying, "One of the Glenwood Electronics best models, a Q57. This model turned out so well they're still manufacturing it. This one isn't self-repairing, but his intelligence level is only slightly below that of computer robots. He can read and write and do simple mathematics. This, of course, conditions him for simple mechanical repair work and even simple bookkeeping." The stranger was a farmer. You could tell by his rough hands, his worn leather clothing, and the squint of his eyes from being out in the steady glare of the Ganymedian Jupiter blaze. What language is it taped for?" he asked. He had a heavy, gruff voice, and although you knew that he wasn't harsh or cruel, he was all business. "Only English," Mr. Simpson said, "but other language tapes are available. I bought him as a companion for my son, and he's been entirely satisfactory in every way. He has a good personality." I knew what was happening. I was being sold, and Mr. Simpson was outlining my good points. That one about personality was very important. Although robots are manufactured to exact specifications and all models should be exactly alike, they are not. Robots have a personality leeway that gives each one a certain individuality within its patterned capacities and limitations. Very few robots know such things about themselves. I know them because Paul and I talked about some of these things. I know that some robots have certain sensibilities that are close to being human. The activating structure in robots is very complicated. When things go wrong with them, the built-in safety factors are supposed to stop them in their tracks, but sometimes the factors do not work and a sick robot keeps right on functioning. Once in a while they go mad and become dangerous and have to be destroyed. A good personality is very important. I understand you're selling them because of shipping costs, the stranger said. That's right. A company rule excludes robots. They aren't on the prepaid personnel relocation lists. It'll be cheaper to buy my son another one when we get back to Earth, if he still feels he wants one. He ought to find plenty of companionship on Earth, the stranger said, and I thought from the tone of his voice that he envied the Simpsons. That's what I'm banking on, Mr. Simpson said. What's your price? I figured about 5,000. That's rather steep. He's a good robot. It would cost you more than that to bring in a simple laboring unit. All right, it's a deal. I'd been conscious for a while now, but I hadn't moved or said anything. Now Mr. Simpson said, Rex, this is your new owner, Mr. Hennings. He has one of the biggest herb farms on the colony. I said, Hello, Mr. Hennings. Hello, Rex, he answered. They tell me you have a pretty high intelligence level. Paul taught me a lot. Well, you won't have much use for it. Not for a while, at least. I'm buying you to work on the farm. Rex can supervise, Mr. Simpson said. I have an overseer for that and 2 helpers. This'll give me 7 robots. I may buy another one later. I was beginning to think that maybe Mr. Hennings was not as kind as I'd thought. But then he said, The boy, does he know his robot's being sold? Yes, Mr. Simpson said. We talked it over. Or maybe you ought to have a chance to say goodbye to Rex, Mr. Hennings suggested. Mr. Simpson smiled. If you've got a little time, I'd appreciate that. How about lunch before you start back? I could do with a bite. Mr. Simpson turned to me. Paul is outside puttering with the skimmer, Rex. Why don't you go out and say goodbye to him? I did as I was ordered and found Paul sitting in the skimmer. He watched in silence as I approached him. Your father sent me to say goodbye. I suppose you think it's my fault that this is my idea, selling you. No, it is your father's idea, and it is very sensible. It would cost too much to take me back to Earth. It's mean, he flared. It isn't fair of them to take you away from me. You're growing up, Paul. You won't need a companion much longer. Oh, quit sounding so noble. What is noble? That's a new word. Here we go again, Paul said. Noble is... Oh, forget it. What good will words be to you picking herbs and scrapping fungus on a farm? Mr. Hennings is a good man. He suggested we have a chance to say goodbye. You think I don't want to say goodbye, don't you? I think you feel bad, Paul. I think you're sad because you have to leave me here. Sure, but you don't see me doing anything about it, do you? I think you would do something if you could. He straightened up suddenly. Get in. Why? He turned his head and stared at me. That's the first time since we've known each other that you've questioned an order I gave you. That's true, I said. I wonder why I did it. Because you aren't mine anymore. You were wondering if Mr. Hennings would want you to get into the skimmer. Do you think that was the reason? Yes, but get in anyhow. We'll go out to the cave. I got in, and Paul steered the speedy skimmer across the surface level of Ganymede. I wondered what his father would say. Would he be angry with Paul for taking me away? It didn't really matter, because we weren't gone very long. I looked forward to going to the hideout again with Paul, but when we got there it wasn't any good somehow. It wasn't the same. We didn't have anything to say to each other. We'd been in the cave for only a few minutes when Paul said, Let's go back. I don't like this place anymore. We walked back to the skimmer and got back to the dome just as Mr. Simpson and my new owner came out. I got into Mr. Hennings' skimmer with him, and after a quick goodbye to Jane and Mrs. Simpson, I rode away with them. When I turned and looked back, they were waving, but Paul was not in sight.